I head CySecK's academic programs, which focus on skilling and promoting research. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. Before we begin, there are a few ground rules. All the attendees to this webinar will be on mute until the completion of the talk from the speaker. We will have a Q&A at the end of the talk. You can either type your question on the chat window or do a raise of hands, in which case we will unmute you. This is the protocol that needs to be followed for any Q&A. So this is the 47th webinar in the Samgachadvam series. We had to pause this webinar series due to some circumstances, but we will now aim to be regular with this series of webinars. Earlier this year, the government of Karnataka took an exciting step by providing cyber security as a specialization option for diploma students. And we at CySecK helped to draft the syllabus for this course. So for the next 1.5 months, we will focus on covering various topics in this syllabus. Whilst we are sure that this initiative will be of assistance to the students who have opted for this specialization, we are confident that it will help other students and working professionals who are interested in cybersecurity as well. Cybersecurity is not just a critical domain, but is also a complex topic. We will aim to provide an overview to each of these domains with opportunities for conducting hands-on activities and sometimes, if required, some pre or post read to help you to go into further depth. We hope that this will kindle your interest to explore further in this domain and different subdomains. The topic of today's webinar is threat modeling, and our speaker for today, Mr. Nikunj Nagalia from Threat Modeler Software Incorporated, will provide an overview of threat modeling and cover issues like what is threat modeling, why is it required, when it is necessary, and how to build a threat model. Further, we will discuss how regulatory standards are mandating threat modeling along with a diagrammatic approach to building threat models. Finally, he will provide guidance through a live example of building a threat model using Threat Modeler. The target audience for this webinar includes anyone who may or may not have prior experience building threat models. So this is an introductory level webinar. On the coming Thursday at the same time slot, we will continue with the 48th webinar in the series, which would be on the topic of application security tools overview. That would be delivered by Mr. Suchit Narayan of Razorpay Corporation. We will issue a communication by tomorrow for registration for the same. You can access previous webinars on the CySecK website as well as on our YouTube channel. I request all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to keep watching out for different announcements for future Samgachadvam webinars on the different social media handles of CySecK. It will help you to get to know when new recordings are out, and it will also help us in getting better traction and visibility. I'll now come to the scheme of today's webinar and the assessment. First, we'll have the webinar itself, which will be delivered by Mr. Nikunj Nagalia, which will be followed by Q&A. After which, we are going to have the assessment, which will be provided at the end of today's webinar. The assessment will be kept open for only 1 hour after conclusion of the webinar and the Q&A. And this will be followed by webinar feedback. These are a few quantitative and qualitative questions we'd like to ask each participant in order to understand how we can improve further webinars. We request you to please use a Gmail ID to take the assessment as it is in Google Forms. It's always preferred that you use a Gmail address. And most importantly, do not use multiple mail addresses per participant. Using multiple mail addresses per participant is only going to harm your chances of certification in case you are found to be eligible for the same, as it will lead to a lot of confusion. We also request you to use the same mail address for all of CySecK for registering and attending the webinars and assessments for all assessments that are hosted by CySecK. Participants who will score 10 or more out of 15 questions in today's assessment would be eligible for a certificate. And those participants who are found eligible for certification will get access to a threat modeling laboratory environment online. Our team will get back to you on this in case you score more than 10 out of 15 in today's assessment. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today, Mr. Nikunj Nagalia. Nikunj leads the Professional Services Initiative at Threat Modeler Software Incorporated. and focuses on implementing a threat modeling practice within Fortune 500, 500, and 1000 companies. Prior to entering the cybersecurity industry, he worked under corporate strategy and project management functions at both large and small organizations. Nikunj is an alumnus of the Doon School of the class of 2008, after which he completed his BCom honors from Sri Ram College of Commerce, University of Delhi in 2011. He then completed his MBA in entrepreneurship from the Franklin W. Olin Graduate School of Business at Babson College in the United States of America in 2018 and is currently based in North America. We would like to thank Nikunj for agreeing to do this webinar in spite of being across different, in spite of operating in a completely different time zone at not a very convenient time of the day. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Nikunj.
All right, thanks Abhishek for that very flattering introduction. But I'm happy to meet you all. And hey everyone, I'm just going to share my screen before I start talking. Okay, screen two, there you go, share. I believe you guys can now start seeing my screen. All right, so welcome to threat modeling. But before I begin with anything, even if you do not have any experience with threat modeling, this course may help you. This kind of webinar may help you, not a course. Simply because if you look at my background specifically, I do not have threat modeling prior experience. All of my experience that I've gained so far is through this company. You may or may not need prior cybersecurity experience within threat modeling or in any other space for that matter to be able to become a genuine threat modeler, and which is where the software that I work for and that I try to implement helps in actually building up the entire expertise as and when you try to build your own threat models. So yes, I have 4 years of prior experience working in this industry, especially working at Threat Modeler Software Inc. And I've been implementing threat modeling in the past, and currently doing so for Fortune 500, 500, and 1,000 orgs. So my approach to threat modeling is a more practical approach. How organizations should be thinking about it, how people should be thinking about building these threat models that I will be talking about, and how to go about, navigating those threat models as and when that happens. Uh, in my past life, in my current life as well, I have held technical account management roles. So I speak with clients directly, and all of my clients are in the organizations that I've listed above. But beyond that, I have a business background, and I have a complete business background, including project management. But you know what? That just really is me. And that's really helped me in actually building a threat model and building threat modeling practices within these organizations. If you want to ever reach out to me, here's my email address. Please do feel free to send me an email any time you want to. And I look forward to interacting with you all. So let's jump right in. What is threat modeling? So threat modeling, in a very simple statement, is an activity performed to identify and capture threats before they happen. Now, this is a heavily loaded statement, but let me just highlight a few key aspects. It's an activity. So it's like a verb. It is something that you need to perform. And you need to basically perform this activity in order to identify and to capture any threats before they happen, right? So threat modeling is always seen to be a proactive exercise, a design phase activity, which means that you're basically modeling these threats as a way so that they do not turn into potential exploits. All right. Further, what threat modeling also helps you do is to identify the defenses where they are needed the most. All organizations have a lot of these defenses. When I'm talking about defenses, I'm talking about firewalls, I'm talking about ACLs, I'm talking about IAMs, I'm talking about all the policies that they've put in place, right? And they have been implemented, right? But have they been implemented at the right place at the right time? So imagining that impact before you actually go ahead and implement these defenses, that's where threat modeling actually comes and helps you, right? So let's break things down, right? A threat, right? Any circumstance or an event with potential to adversely impact an organization, organizational operations, organizational assets, individuals, other organizations, or nation through a system. So now you understand the gamut of the threat modeling world, What does that gamut mean? A gamut is, it's not just these organizations that we're talking about, right? I'm talking about the assets within that organization. I'm also talking about individuals like you and I. We all are very aware about phishing attacks, social engineering attacks that continuously happen. And yes, they kind of find the vulnerability within a particular human, perhaps, right? But the larger impact is also got to do with the nations, right? So one government being attacked by another, perhaps, right? So a threat is anything which basically poses some kind of harm to these kinds of individuals, these kinds of organizations, these kinds of nations. And this description has pretty much been copy pasted from the NIST 853 guidance, or the NIST guidances around threat modeling as well. Further, let's see what an activity is. And now this basically gets into regulatory standards. Regulatory standards have actually said that as the activity for threat modeling is creating or importing an architectural diagram. Further, the activity refers to collaborating and building a standardized and centralized repository. Now, hear me out on this one. Yes, a diagram is important, but what is also important is that there is enough info sharing between organizations and peers, right? Between organizations and peers to be able to share and build a centralized repository of information. What that means is that if I have a particular piece of information that might help XYZ applications, I would want to put that in one place so that all those XYZ applications get impacted equally. All those XYZ applications have the same level of risk tolerance, have the same level of risk profiles, for that matter, to be able to deal with a particular issue. Why this is important is because if you're building a centralized repository, that means you are actually looking at your defenses, relooking at your defenses, relooking your policies, and building robust documentation around the same, right? So there we go. Now, this repository, what I'm talking about, this repository can be threats, can be security requirements or remediations, can be properties, attributes, or context. Threat modeling gets into the design. That means you have to dive deeper. Dive deeper in the sense you start with what you know, and then beyond that, you get into, what else can I find out about my application? What kind of technology stacks am I using? What kind of third-party services that I'm using? So kind of looking at your entire software bill of materials. And then from there, moving forward into actually building out this diagram cohesively and completely at that map. All right. So now let's start discussing what the characteristics of a threat are. So a threat needs an adversary. An adversary is a bad actor, right? A bad person, for that matter, usually assumed as a hacker. Hear me out on this one. It is usually a hacker, but can be any outsider, insider, organization, government who has malicious intent, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to be a hacker. You need to basically identify and kind of broaden that scope and say that anybody who has malicious intent against you is that adversary. And threat modeling helps you identify that adversary as also. The next part about a threat is that it needs an objective. So any person who has a malicious intent, and you can basically go through the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and what you'll notice is that there is always an objective, and the objective is usually found out by due reconnaissance, right? A reconnaissance activity would mean that they would actually be in the system for a while before actually conducting the attack, or before actually entering the system as well. They will try to identify what are the various entry points where I can enter. So due reconnaissance is performed prior to an attack to identify the motive of the attack. Example, if I need to have a high data asset, or I need to perform a denial of service, right? Then the next step that this adversary would want to do is to identify that weakness. A weakness is a known loophole. It can pretty much be in the form of, let's say, a vulnerability within a third-party software that this application is utilizing, right? So if you're using a Windows 2016 server, perhaps it has a list of 400 odd vulnerabilities that lead to about 100 odd weaknesses. And those are the kinds of weaknesses that these attackers or these adversaries are kind of looking at. And then finally, how do they basically do it, which is what you call as a method. An act by way of which this weakness can be exploited is a method. Now, threat modeling and threat modelers specifically will focus on most of this. How do I basically stop all these methods of attacks? Yes, we want to get there, but as long as we get here, we are in a decent position. But you know what? We will talk about both these aspects when I do my live demo. Next, what we talk about is what are controls. Controls are defenses that either are activities or assets. Now, what I mean by an activity, what I mean by an asset, let's differentiate the two. An activity is something that you basically implement as, let's say, as a security protocol within your application, right? What do I mean by security protocol? It may be like if I have a data storage somewhere, I may want to encrypt that data storage, right? Now, so encryption as an activity is a control, but then if I'm utilizing encryption keys to protect my data or to encrypt that data, that encryption key in itself becomes the control, which is that asset, right? These controls are always designed to protect the system. For example, firewalls are designed to basically stop network traffic. ACLs do pretty much the same thing. Vulnerability scanners, to a certain extent, act as certain controls because they help you identify, so they fall under logging and monitoring, and IAM as well, which is identity and access management. But controls are often treated as an attack entry point. What I mean by that is that these are the first lines of defenses that the attackers or the adversary may actually know of, either bypassing, navigating, circumventing, whatever you want to call that. But the controls are the ones that get attacked, and they should themselves be threat modeled, which is where threat modeling comes in very, very handy. Why? Because they help you understand the impact of a control, the most important parts of your application for that matter. So within threat modeling, when we start to build our threat models, these are the two things we're going to take care of. What are our assets and what are our controls? And we're going to basically merge the two. We're going to see the impact, and then we're going to move forward from there. So what is needed for threat modeling, right? So what is needed for threat modeling? And let's first understand that impact of threat modeling, right? It is very important to notice that the impact of a cyber attack or a cyber event is either financial or physical or reputational, right? For organizations and for governments specifically, the reputation is also at stake. When we're talking about major attacks that have happened, we are looking at organizations being named out, and obviously that leads to all a financial burden when we're looking at, let's say, PR extensive efforts that are taken to kind of navigate those situations once the attack has happened. So as and when you basically get more reactive to a particular attack, things get more expensive, right? And targets are usually these large organizations which carry or process sensitive information, and governments are also often targets of cyber attacks. But there is a higher risk. Now, when we're talking about consumer industries, when we're talking about, let's say, automotive or medical device industries, the risk doesn't really end at the organization. The risk can actually end at a human life incident, right? Think, for example, that you're driving a vehicle which is basically a highly autonomous vehicle, or not even autonomous. Let's talk about any vehicle which has got all these sensors to measure tire pressure, or to measure brake sensitivity, or to perhaps measure or to perhaps even connect to your stereo, right? Now, all of these protocols that they're using is what you call as Bluetooth. It is a vulnerable protocol, right? And it is connected to a network beyond that. These links are going to help you to understand what that impact can be. But just to give you a quick peek into all of this, this particular link, which I'm talking about, DEFCON 23, this one actually looks at how two, I would say, hackers, but they're pretty much cybersecurity experts who actually went ahead and were able to run a Jeep off ground. They ran a Jeep off ground simply by remotely connecting to the Bluetooth system of that car, and therefore disabling the brakes altogether. Then, when you're talking about implanted med devices, perhaps pacemakers. Now, in these pacemakers, the impact can be that, yes, somebody can actually stop your heart, right? So who is responsible for building this threat model? Here is where organizations really need to basically come into a risk profile, that is understanding that impact of seeing, what is table stakes for us. Is it financial? Is it reputation? Is it physical? Or am I looking at risk to human life, right? Which is where all bets are off. I need to fix this particular issue. And this is where threat modeling can actually come in and help you become more proactive rather than reactive. Now, a quick fact. You've heard of ransomware, you must have heard of ransomware. The US government treats ransomware with the same level of vigilance as it treats a terrorism attack. What that means is that this is the need of the hour. This is the need of the hour. Anybody who's blackmailing you for any particular kind of data so that they can extort any kind of money or information from you, that is treated as a terrorism attack. So yes, it is gaining more and more importance. That means that this is the need of the hour. So why should I build the threat model? As I discussed before, security incidents of financial, physical, reputational burden once they occur. Threat modeling is a proactive exercise performed to implement security within the design phases of the application. That means it happens pre-deployment or pre-development, right? So there is always a starting point for the threat model, but there is never an ending point for the threat model. It is always treated as something that before my developers actually start working on it, they are building this threat model. The eventual goal of threat modeling is to lead an application which is secure by design. Now that is a term which is utilized a lot across the board. Secure by design pretty much means that yes, I've implemented across all the phases of an application build lifecycle. Perhaps I've basically taken care of security within it, right? So threat modeling is a huge part of it. But lastly, regulatory standards. Now, when we're talking about NIST 853, when we're talking about PCI DSS, when we're talking about FDA, they are all now starting to mandate threat modeling. So now the latest NIST 853 Rev 5, which was, I think, released in 2021, has mandated a particular way of threat modeling, which basically requires an architectural diagram. And you'll notice why an architectural diagram is necessary, simply because once I start showing you the platform, you will see how an architectural diagram makes it very easy. There are multiple ways in which you can build a threat model. It can be as easy as you writing on a piece of paper and kind of converting that into a Word document, going from that to an Excel document, then going from that into perhaps a question answer based approach. But now what you'll notice is that if you build an architectural diagram, you're not just taking care of all of those issues, but you're also taking care of all of the things that you see as design flaws being taken into account. FDA is talking about all pre-market med devices. So consider any updates to a pacemaker that, let's say, any organization is any med device organization is making. Those fall under the gamut of threat modeling. That means they need to basically be secure by design in the first place itself. Which brings me to a great point now. So threat modeling may just be seen as a software security activity, but it is not. It goes beyond software security. It enters hardware security. It enters firmware. It enters DevOps management, for that matter, as well. So threat modeling is omnipresent across any cyber landscape, perhaps, if you want to look at it that way. So when do I threat model? Now that's a brilliant question, right? I have already got an application which is a legacy application, perhaps, right? I have that application now. Should I build a threat model? Why? Because I never built a threat model for that before, right? So for pre-existing applications, what you want to start with is what you know. As you all may know, an application is always evolving. That means there are iterations, there are updates, there are patch management updates performed on those applications every day, every month, every year, right? So for those applications, you want to basically start with what you know about that application. That is day zero. And from there, you start basically gathering the requirements, right? So you build on every iteration, gather the requirements of the next update, right? And implement a threat model at the time when the requirements have all been gathered. You basically build the threat model alongside and be done with it, right? And then basically keep your threat model live so that the next application update contains that threat modeling update as well alongside with it. And for new applications, it's fairly simple. You basically put this as a requirements management activity. What you'll notice very soon is that for pre-existing applications, right? Uh, and as and when applications are first deployed and then basically go through the next change, what you'll notice is that threat modeling becomes part of the entire change management routine, right? So anytime in an agile build process, you're looking at change management as that big buzzword, threat modeling fits right there. What that means is that you're looking at building a threat model anytime there's a change happening in your organization's applications, and perhaps you're also looking at implementing the threat modeling when your requirements are being gathered, right? So you are now paying security its due importance. Why? Because you already know what the impact can be, right? And this is where regulatory standards are also implementing a lot of emphasis on what threat modeling should be, even if it's a pre-existing application or if it's a new application. So once a threat model is built, continue to evolve the threat model every time the application goes through a change. That means every time, once I've built with my base threat model, I can basically start building on top of that. And that's where I head from one place to another. So how do I build a threat model? I gather the requirements. And this gathering of the requirements, and I will basically talk about stakeholders and all of this. So let's go one slide further, and then we'll come back on this one. There are some key stakeholders within threat modeling, right? The first stakeholder is the product team. The product team is responsible for the application. It consists of developers, it consists of project managers, it consists of product managers, it consists of external consultants who we have basically hired to build the application, DevOps engineers. So they are all part of the product team. And they should be building threat model. Why? Because they're the closest to the application. They know exactly what the application architecture must look like or how their application is going to communicate. They know the requirements for the new iteration that's happening on the application, perhaps. Then you have the security teams. They are responsible for security within applications. Yes, absolutely. They are the ones who are basically approving a threat model, and they consist of, let's say, CISOs, they consist of security architects, pen testers, etc. Right? And their job needs to be to review and approve the models, right? So you'll notice when I show you the demo how everything flows together. And then you have the governance, risk, and compliance. They are pretty much the overseers of this entire activity. Think of them as auditors of the entire practice of threat modeling. And they're responsible for maintaining standardized documentation around risks and controls. And they should identify areas where security documentation is lacking and implement a standardized repository. So now going back to how do I build a threat model, I need to gather my requirements first. Who gathers requirements is the product team, right? Application teams use agile boards to capture requirements. Then you identify the application within which you identify the assets within the application that you'll be using, define the sensitivity of the data, and rely on pre-existing modules. That means you can actually make threat modeling a templated activity, right? And you'll see that when I pull up the platform, you'll see that. Then you basically get into building the model. So you're not just starting building the threat model, you first gathering the requirements, then you build the model. Building the model is a simple part. What I mean by that is you're just basically placing everything on an architectural diagram. Then you identify where you basically follow recommendations on how and where to place the controls. And then you push these findings into your agile board where you've gathered all your requirements. Simply because you are now treating security as part of the process, it better be part of the process. That means you want to basically push it into your agile boards. Here I'm talking about Jira. Then you review the model, right? This part is conducted by the security teams. So have a security champion come in and review your model for completeness and accuracy. And once they basically have reviewed that entire thing for its sanctity, they can go ahead and approve, but then they have another job of basically maintaining and telling the governance, risk, and compliance teams, hey guys, you need to update the repository for X, Y, and Z policies, perhaps. After the review of the model is complete, you go into implementation. This is where the product team comes in again. They're looking at the Jira boards. They have now all the security requirements that they need to take into account. They implement these individual requirements and trace back the statuses to reanalyze the risk profile of your particular application. That means the threat modeling solution should actually take back these findings and update the threat model with the latest and the greatest. And then finally, you continue to enhance the model. So from previous models, ensure documentation around security is kept updated. This is a GRC activity, governance, risk, and compliance. A new iteration should then be added into the model because this model should be kept live as long as your application is alive. All right. So with that, I know I just had a very, very short stint of a presentation. I hope I did not make most of you fall asleep, but I will now go ahead and showcase my screen with the live threat modeling demo. All right. So what you're looking at over here is a software, right? For now, think about this threat model as just software which is helping you build a threat model. And you'll soon realize why softwares have become an important aspect of threat modeling simply because they help you standardize this information. They help you load as many people as you want and actually expand the purview of threat modeling than just it being the security activity. That just currently is treated as a security team's activity and initiative has now become an initiative organization, right? And that's where a software actually comes and helps you. So while yes, I need to threat modeler as well, I should also be utilizing its powers and prowess in order to make sure that I am threat modeling every other application. So how do I build a threat model? Let's get into a diagramming example, right? So what I'll do is I will start with importing a template. And a template is what I spoke about in my previous slide, which I mentioned that yes, you want to rely on existing modules as well. So let's see if I have a basic web application hosting. Let's see, I can now say that I'm basically building an application on AWS. So let's say application on AWS version 1.13, whatever I want to call it. And then I'll go ahead and give a quick description. This application will be looking at PII information, and I'll give this a risk of high, and I'll create. So what you notice is that you'll be brought into an architectural landscape. An architectural landscape, that means that there will be a diagram that you will have, and a diagram that basically carries information from the get-go, but we will be able to enhance more and more of this information. All right, let me just actually pull in another template. All right. So let's say this is the entire architectural landscape where I'll be building this particular threat model, around which I'll be building a threat model. That means I have a particular I have a code repository, and from my code repository is going into a registry. From my registry, it's basically coming down to a container service model, which is then kind of pushing all these changes into, let's say, my web application where it's running inside of an EC2 instance, right? Better yet, let me actually also go ahead. So now you basically think about, yes, I have an organization which has already an approved process of deploying an application using an Elastic Container System, and so on and so forth, right? But this is not the place where it all ends. This is just the starting point. You could, however, also start with, let's say, I have a web application. And this web application is going to be running inside of a web server. Now in AWS, in Amazon Web Services terms, the web server is called an EC2. So I'm going to basically place this web application inside of the web server. Now, this is where you now start looking at why diagramming is important. Why? Because I can now start layering all of this information on top of one another. So there is the web application running inside an EC2 instance, and I will basically call this the presentation layer. And then there is a similar logic for the backend layer. And now alongside this web application, what I have is, let's say, let's see if I have a code base. Let's see, secure code frame. No, actually not, right? OS process. Let's see that there's an operating system process running inside of it. Let's see there is a repository, or let's say, okay, let's just use these two components. And then finally, I'll get into the last part, which is there is a data layer as well. And in that data layer, what I have is a database, which is running inside an AWS service called Relational Database Service. And I'll just place the database inside of it, right? So all of a sudden, you're now also looking at this being a diagramming activity, but now let's connect all the three together. So information, that means there is a user who is coming in. And this user is perhaps going to hit a generic page, which is going to be running, let's say, on this Chrome browser. So I'll see if I have Chrome. I do not have Chrome. I'll see if I have browser. I have a web browser. So there's a generic page, which is my URL. And I'll name this URL www.threatmodeler.com, right? I'll say that there is a web browser, users are connecting into the web browser. And from this web browser, what's happening is that the user is, that this request is being sent into AWS through, let's say, an internet gateway, right? And from the internet gateway, it is going into a load balancer. Let's call it an ELB. And from there, it's coming down into the presentation layers and so on and so forth. You saw me drag and drop all of my pieces. That means I have the software bill of materials on top of this, right? I have everything related to my application in terms of assets already defined. So now all I have to do is connect them. That means I'm defining at every step of the process, how things are transferring and where things are transferring. So the user is basically sitting somewhere outside my network and he's connecting to www.threatmodeler.com. From threatmodeler.com, that request is going into an AWS EC2 gateway. From that EC2 gateway, that request is being transferred to a load balancer, which is acting like a firewall before my system. And from that ELB, the information is further flowing down to the presentation layer, which is presenting this application right here. And from your presentation layer, it's going into the backend layer where my code is being managed. And from my code is being managed, processed, or perhaps your API calls are being returned and transferred. And from there, the API calls are being made to, let's say, my database. Very simply put. Now let's do one last step and let's actually start classifying all of the information inside boundaries. Why? Because this user is not part of my AWS environment. This user does not have access to AWS directly. They're basically gaining access to AWS through a web front face, but there is a load balancer stopping all of that in the middle. So what I'll do is I'll group this and I'll call this a trust boundary. And I'll say that all of this is running inside an AWS VPC. And further, this VPC my internet connection just got cut for no reason. But can you guys hear me?
Yes, Nikunj, you're audible.
Awesome. There you go. Now this VPC, let's just go back into this live example and say that this is running inside my AWS account. The reason why I'm classifying all of this is because I want to notice like what things can I potentially change versus what things I can't, right? Things that are happening inside my logical zone. That means these are all assets that I own. Perhaps this is also an asset that I own, but this user is not the asset that I own. This user is something that I want to basically see or block perhaps. I would want to treat this as an adversary, but these are users that are necessary for my application to run. That's why I want to basically classify them on my diagram as well. And so now with this, I'll also kind of get into the nitty-gritties of it. This requires a security group. So what I'll do is I'll group this inside a security group and say that, all right, this is security group. And I'll put this also inside a security group. And I'll put this inside a security group as well. There you go. So what I have is a basic 3-tier architecture. If you saw me building this, you saw if I just built a basic 3-tier architecture. This already has information. That means wherever I see a red dot, you're seeing all of the places where there are potential attacks or where there are potential threats that can take place. So let's take a look at this, right? So if I'm looking at, let's say, this web application, I will see software security related threats, right? On my web application, I have gotten 50 threats that I need to look at. And there is perhaps, let's say, authentication abuse, application footprinting. Now, why do I have authentication abuse? I can now start looking at that information right here. And these are all the informations that you would probably need to make an informed decision whether or not should I fix it or whether should I actually leave it as is. That means, can I change the risk profile of this, right? If I have authentication abuse on this particular application, what are the table stakes? So I'm basically kind of defining either this is very low or perhaps this is very high, right? And then beyond that, I want to see how do I prevent this authentication abuse. So I basically give you all the IAM related requirements right here itself. But before I also kind of start navigating into all of this, there is decision making required. So now for that, what I'll do is I'll start adding context on top of on top of these things. So for example, on this OS process, right? On this OS process, I want to basically say that there is a particular technology stack. So again, my software bill of materials, I will try to go in and say, all right, let's start to put in a Windows 2016 server, which is in uh, Windows 2016. I'll search for this. Yeah, let's just look at this particular Windows 2003 R2, perhaps. So I have associated a particular technology stack that's running in on the CC2, on this particular instance, which is basically my operating system, where all the things are all these things are working. More importantly, this particular backend layer, right, is dealing with certain types of data, right? So I will say that this is dealing with PII information, and this is also dealing with information like, let's say, I am capturing social security numbers, right? And perhaps anybody who is, let's say, a developer and anybody who's a security manager or perhaps is an admin can access this particular asset, right? And so now what I'll do is I'll save these changes. What you'll notice is that the risk profile will change of all of this, all of the threats that are presented on the diagram, simply because we've now captured new information. New information in the form like, all right, if I'm looking at the backend layer, now I have a lot new threats that go just beyond my AWS specific. So I'm looking at sensitive data exposure. Why? Because I chose sensitive data as one of the assets that this particular EC2 or this particular server will be processing, handling, or storing. Similarly, on my OS process, I'm looking at a lot of these threats where I'm looking at process injection, where I'm looking at VDSO hacking and things like that, that start falling into place. More importantly, if there are any known vulnerabilities to that particular OS process, those will all be listed out over here as well. All right. So now let's go into the next part. I have built a threat model. I am looking at all of this, but what I have not identified yet are my controls. Now, a product team member may understand, yes, these are my controls in place, but what is better off left to the software in itself is the software should recommend what my control should be. So now looking at this diagram, at any given place, I have a list of XYZ number of controls that I can put into place and actually start mitigating threats. So now over here, you're starting to see where can I reduce my impact the most. So now if I use AWS STS on the presentation layer, on the backend layer, on the RDS, on the ELB, on the VPC, I can now start taking care of a lot of threats. So what I'll do is I'll use the STS. Where do we have the STS over here? Let's search. And I will place that STS somewhere between the EC2, between the gateway and the ELB, right? And what you'll notice is automatically that this control would have mitigated a lot of the threats right there itself. So I have the STS mitigating a lot of controls. So I'm not, there you go. And you'll see that the status would have changed automatically. Oops, it did not. Yeah, mitigations applied. Now let's go back to the diagram. You'll see that 11 threats have already been closed out. And most of them have got to do with account hijacking on the ELB, RDS, backend layer, presentation layer, anything that has been there on my diagram as an asset, those particular threats have been taken care of. and they have all been mitigated by the control. So now you're basically looking at control efficacy and control impact. Had I not placed this STS here, had I placed them somewhere over here, they would have only taken care of, let's say, the RDS. Or had I placed the STS only on my diagram, perhaps they would have not taken into account the impact at all. So what this allows you to do is actually help you place your controls at the right place where there is the maximum amount of impact. But more importantly, what you'll notice is specifically with the STS or perhaps any other control, you may see certain security requirements that you want to put in place. Let me give you as an example. On the web application firewall, let's see if there are any requirements. There you go. On the web application firewall, right? When I was talking about security controls being attack entry points themselves, this is where I would want to basically implement certain security requirements on those controls itself so that they can actually be treated as hardened assets rather than just assets. So these controls have an activity of protecting my system, but they need to be put inside my threat model and treated as an attack entry point in itself, that I want to understand what those table stakes are. Where can things go wrong so that I can say that, all right, I need to basically prevent SQL injection on this particular control. Absolutely, I do, so that I do not fall for a SQL injection attack across my enterprise. My web application firewall is sitting in between the user who's interacting on a form on my web page, and that web application firewall is then sending traffic to, let's say, the database, where the data is being either authenticated or the data is being processed in a certain way, right? So my web application firewall is sitting there, so that web application firewall better have a SQL injection prevention, simply because if it is a SQL database, you are looking at a user pretty much circumventing that information if it's not configured correctly. So you want to basically threat model not just your assets, but also your controls in the similar light and fashion. And from here, what you can do is, a product team member has built this particular model, and I close this out. I close this out. A product team member has built this particular threat model. Now, from this threat model, what they will do is they will start reviewing information. Now, this is where the security guy comes in. The security champion will come in over here. They will start reviewing the information. What are there you go. What those threats are. So I'm looking at by risk. So I'm looking at everything which is very high, then going from very high through to very low. So I'm looking at 102 very high risk threats. I'm looking at action spoofing on the generic web page, and the security requirements right now, I don't have any, but perhaps I have test cases that I can look at. So I want to basically prevent clickjacking. So these are all my clickjacking related test cases that basically will help me prevent action spoofing. From here, I can basically say that these have been closed or mitigated. I can start managing the statuses. Better yet, I can send this into my own Jira boards. I can send this into my own application boards. So the security guy, what they will do is they will take these requirements and they will push this out into a Jira board. This is again why software is important, to basically understand what a threat model can do and what a threat modeling output can be, right? So you're specifically looking at, let's say, sending out these requirements into a Jira board, where you're connected with an API from, let's say, threat modeler to that Jira board. And anytime there's a status update in Jira, will automatically trickle the status update in threat model. Anytime there's a note or a comment placed in Jira, will automatically place a note or a comment in threat modeler as well. So this is where both a diagramming approach and a software-based approach is very, very important when it comes to threat modeling. Now let's get into the next part, which is where the governance, risk, and compliance teams are sitting. Right. So I have over here what you call is the knowledge base. A knowledge base is, in threat modeler, it's called the threat framework. A knowledge base is that centralized repository, right? So there are, in an organization, let's talk about a very, very usual Fortune 500 company. A Fortune 500 company is looking at tens of thousands of developers divided across, let's say, hundreds of different teams, right? So automatically that organization, by its sheer size, is not going to have, needs to have a centralized place of intelligence where things can be managed in a centralized fashion. For example, I'm talking about encryption. I'm talking about encryption requirements. A documentation needs to be maintained and kind of built over and over again, so that now anytime any team member, be it from team in India, be it from team in US, be it from team in Jakarta, perhaps, right? You're looking at them actually building the same, if they're using the same component, they're basically dealing with the same information on that same component. That means if I'm using elevated privilege controls, I can now look at what I need to do as a way to mitigate those particular threat, right? So this is how I will go ahead and build my entire documentation. Documentation in the form that tomorrow, if I'm looking at a higher impact, right? So perhaps for my application footprinting, I'm seeing only use software restriction policy or tools that restrict program execution. I will now also start kind of thinking, hey, GRC team, we need better documentation on it so they can just update it at one place. Automatically is going to trickle a workflow into all of your threat models that you've built that uses that same web application component, right? So this, in essence, is all of that encapsulated as that threat model. But most importantly, what you can also get into is from a regulatory standard perspective, right? Now, this regulatory standard perspective, what you're looking at is I'm building a compliance report. So I can now start building reports around my regulatory standards. Right here, I have NIST 853 Ref 4 or Ref 5 perhaps, and I can simply generate a report. Now, I'm not going to do this right now because it takes a little bit of time. So once I generate this, what I will have is a compliance summary. So anybody who's actually looking at it from an auditory perspective is now looking at this particular threat model with the compliance lens, saying, have I actually completed all the activities that were necessary for me to be actually compliant with a particular regulatory standard at that? All right. So with that, I want to say that I have completed my entire activity of providing this webinar. I will take any questions if there are. Abhishek, if you want me to take any.
Yes, thank you very much, Nikunj. I'm sure that was an extremely interesting webinar, and that was also an extremely interesting demonstration. And thanks for doing this halfway across the world.
Oh, no worries at all. I'm happy to do this.
Yeah, and yeah, so we've got one question in the chat which asks, is this tool in sync with MITRE attack framework for fetching adversary tactics?
Yes and no. I will try to answer this. MITRE attack framework is a beautiful framework that helps you understand not just the tactics, it also helps you understand the techniques and the procedures under that. So what threat modeler will actually take into account is the procedure part of it, more importantly. Why? But we'll also kind of highlight. So let me just actually look at, if I have, let's say over here, I open a MITRE attack framework thread. So if I can look at that 1 second real quickly, account footprinting, let's go into description. Now I have that MITRE attack tactic over here, right? And that tactic has been given right here itself. So there is a tactic, yes, but there is also the procedure that we lay out right under this as well. So yes, this tool does that. And it is a very important aspect of the tool as well. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have another one. Also, please indicate how we can leverage threat model techniques like STRIDE or DREAD.
Right. Now, I don't want to take a controversial stand on this, but I will take a controversial stand on this. STRIDE is a way of categorization. STRIDE is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, in incident response, and elevation of privileges, disaster recovery for that matter, right? Under these categories, you have a bunch of threats, right? So STRIDE helps you categorize that. Absolutely. It has been the known methodology of threat modeling. But what essentially you're looking at is, if you really want to, with threat modelers specifically, you can take any of these and start tagging them under the STRIDE categories for that matter. So STRIDE will help you. All right, I want to basically protect my application against all spoofing. Yes, absolutely. Anything which is basically tagged as spoofing, you can take that into account right here itself. But what threat modeler really does really well in this particular case, and I'm just not going to basically just take my side because I have to take my side, but I will take my side over here simply because I see the power of the tool, is that it helps you identify the operational level of a particular threat, how that attack is potentially possible. It helps you basically look at it from that particular lens. Instead of just a categorization, I'm looking at all the attacks that are potential to happen, and then I just navigate the risk rating where I want to. And then tagging, yes, tagging is appropriate and it is necessary, absolutely, but that's where threat modeler is actually sitting. It's basically looking at it from a different methodology and a different lens altogether. When we're talking about visual, that means I have a diagram. It is agile. That means as and when my change requirements are being gathered, this threat model is being updated. I'm basically looking at it as a simple exercise that somebody's building a diagram, somebody's reviewing it, and that's it, right? And that's what threat modeling should be. And that's what threat modeler actually starts elevating and pushing across.
Okay, I think we can wait maybe a minute or two.
Yeah,
We
sure.
might.
No worries.
Yeah, okay, so here's another one.
Mm-hmm.
Does this tool indicate threat associated with resource on its own and suggest what controls to include to reduce risk?
Correct. Yes, this tool does that. I don't know if that's a question or a statement, but let's say if I'm looking at my generic web page, I'm looking at content spoofing. Do I have security? Let's actually go to one which I have where I have security requirements. Let's go into presentation layer. I have all of these threats, right? I have insecure interfaces and APIs as a threat. Now, to take care or to basically navigate of this particular threat, I will look at, let's say, ensuring that the host OS is built on a pre-approved AMI, right? That this particular operating system is actually utilizing an image which is approved by my organization, and I can get into the details of those. So I basically need to build a golden AMI, and then from there I'm basically going to share that in a secure fashion, and all of that guidance is provided by the platform. But all of that guidance is expected by any GRC team member to actually build and actually perform as steps to implement these requirements.
Okay, thank you, Nikunj. I think can maybe wait just a minute longer and see
Yeah,
if there
sure.
are any
No,
questions.
no worries. No worries. I'm here. I'm here.
Dear participants, any questions for Nikunj, please free to post them in the chat box.
So I can see the next question. What hands-on exercise shall we do? Any use case which we can try? That's a very, 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 very good question. Um, I want to say that take any example that you would know of, let's say, I over here, if you want to recreate this particular example, feel free to. Let's say over here I used an example of a web application hosted on an AWS three-tier architecture. You can utilize the same example, perhaps utilize, let's say, another cloud provider, perhaps, or perhaps you want to basically use, let's say, an application which is hosted on an on-premise infrastructure, right? The outcome should be the same, but the threat profiles should be different. In the sense that yes, you will have different implementation strategies of security on those particular threat profiles. So you are looking at a differing output by a different CSP for that matter, but absolutely try any use case that you feel is most important. If you want, you can even go and venture into med devices for that matter. That I am threat modeling a pacemaker. If you want, we can what I can do is I can actually help you implement certain templates on there which you can start utilizing and start building. So I have actually given I will be working with Abhishek and the CySecK team to generate access on the platform. So as and when the access is ready for you guys, you will notice that there are a bunch of templates that you can start utilizing and start building threat models from. So anything that piques your interest and falls under the cyber landscape, you can pretty much do it. And no, this tool is not open source, but we are happy to give you access to it. So the permissions will be granted. What you're looking at is TM Demo 6 as a website. The website that I have created for you all is KSCST.threatmodeler.net. Don't worry about the access part. I know that there is a quiz that you guys need to take before we can start going forward with that. So I will let Abhishek drive that. But yes, once you will get the permissions as and when your time permits.
Yes, dear participants, we are going to have an assessment shortly, and those who clear the assessment and become eligible for certification will be part of the cohort that gets access. So Nikunj, it is now 4:30, and I'd like to thank you for this very interesting webinar on threat modeling,
No worries. I
and for
appreciate
all
that.
the practical examples, and for a lot of pain that you have taken to craft this presentation, not just the theoretical part, but I'm sure that all the participants enjoyed the hands-on, because I'm sure that has got them all excited, and we also look forward to many of them taking the certification, and many of them accessing the lab. So we'd like to thank you for joining us from halfway across the world.
Oh, no, absolutely. My pleasure, and I hope that this session was helpful to you all. Please do reach out to me, and I'm going to leave my email address on the chat. Please do reach out to me directly if you really have any questions on. Let's go to everyone over here, nikunj.nagalia, threatmodeler.com, and I will also, I don't know if I have my LinkedIn handy over here. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn. It's very easy to find Nikunj Nagalia and just type the name of the company that I work for, which is Threat Modeler. If you were paying attention today, yes, you will find me on LinkedIn. If you weren't paying attention to me today, I hope we cross paths some other time as well. But yes, you can reach out to me at nikunj.nagalia at threatmodeler.com or on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to connect with you all. I'm more than happy to address all of your queries. And I was really, really happy to answer all of your questions if you had any, and all the best.
Yes, thank you very much, Nikunj. Yeah, so dear participants, I've posted the link to the assessment, and the assessment will remain active only for 60 minutes. So please ensure that you take the assessment within 60 minutes. And all the questions in the assessment will be based on whatever you've listened to Nikunj say, whatever was part of his presentation. So if you have been paying attention, you should not have any difficulty in answering the questions.
Perfect. So, Abhishek, should I drop off?
Yeah, yes, Nikunj, yes, you can drop off now.
All right. Thank you so
Thank you so
much,
much.
everyone. Bye bye.
Yeah, bye. So dear participants, you can also check out the link that I have posted. It's a link to the webinar section on the CySecK website. You will also be able to see the link to the assessment over there. And there's just another 59 minutes left. So please take the assessment as soon as possible.